Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thanks so much for joining me for today's devotional taken from the book He Still Calms Storms. Today we're looking at devotional day number 2, and it's entitled The Perfect Storm. On October 30th, 1991, a hurricane came up the eastern seaboard, and it came in contact with a nor'easter that was coming down from the Arctic. And as they interface with each other, not to confuse anyone, the weather the weather people that call the storms, they didn't give it a storm name because they didn't want to confuse anybody. And so this unnamed storm hit the north coast Atlantic seaboard, and it just happened that a 70-foot fishing boat was actually going out called the Andrea Gale to go ahead and catch some fish. This fishing boat went out and didn't return back when it was supposed to on November 1st. And so they sent out search crews, and they never found this fishing boat called the Andrea Gale. And from the story, all eyes were lost. Sebastian Junger, he wrote a book based on that true story, which ended up becoming a movie, which George Clooney was in. A great movie. And so it's a sad story talking about a perfect storm. And maybe for you right now, you're going through a storm that's maybe unnamed. Maybe there are things happening in your life that are just putting you at unease, and you're really facing a perfect storm. There's situations around you, there's relationships that are struggling, and there's turmoil maybe inside of you, and so you're facing this perfect storm maybe in your own life. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, it talks about the disciples. They were facing their own stormy situation that they were going through. It says that, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, and they were far from land, and a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on water, they were terrified, and they cried out in fear that it's a ghost. They were so fearful in the midst of the storm. If you know the rest of the story, Peter begs Jesus and says, "If it's really you, prove it to me. Ask me to step out of the boat." It's kind of crazy to think about this story, that Peter, he's where it's safe, and yet to prove who Jesus is for his identity, his proof of identification, Peter says, "Ask me to get out of the boat." Only a crazy person would ask Jesus to do that. And so Peter does, and amazingly enough, he walks on water, the only human being ever to do so. And yet he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and he starts to sink in the water. The encouragement and challenge for us is this, that you may feel alone like the disciples, and you wonder if anyone knows or cares about what you're going through. But our encouragement today is this: know that Jesus will always come through for you in your storm. And the extra bonus is this: don't get out of the boat. When Jesus is in your boat, you can be sure that everything is going to be okay. For further study, I would encourage you to go to Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 32, to read more of the story of Peter walking on the water. Thanks so much for joining me today.